Welcome everybody. Happy Saturday, and thank you so much for taking the time to join me, and thank you to the Historical Society for inviting me to be a part of this. It's really a privilege to talk to you today. My goal is to give you the guidance and some insight and help you dig a little deeper into your past and into your history and help you unlock some of the secrets, hopefully, of your ancestry and your genealogy just using your family photographs. Now, normally when I give this presentation, it's very hands-on, obviously in person, and I like to pass around pieces from my physical collection so that you can actually handle all the different types and genres of photographs. Because we are in the Zoomiverse, I'm going to really try and take my time to explain the idiosyncrasies of the different formats and try and give you as much information as I can. So for any questions, if you can use the Q&A function at the bottom bar, if you can use the question and answer function, Mary Spears is going to try and moderate those questions so that we can kind of have some organization, and we're all a little new with this, so if you can just bear with us, and thank you. So let's jump right into this. A little bit first about Coyle Studios. We've been in business for over 20 years, and here at Coyle, we are deep into the science of photography. As artists, we are very technical and scientifically trained, and we are got deep roots in traditional chemistry. We currently have a museum conservator on staff. She works on a lot of the paintings, does the fittings, the conservation work. And one of the great things about our studio is we use the same technology, the same capturing methods as the Smithsonian Institute, the larger museums. So we're privately held, and it gives us just a unique vantage point. Early on, some of the first members of our teams, one of our first partners was actually in his 80s, and he was Eisenhower's photographer. And then our next employee came from like the golden age of photo labs, and he finished his last 10 years in business with us as part of our team. And why I mention that is having that hands-on knowledge, representing those hands-on techniques and accumulating that knowledge just gives us a little bit of breadth and depth in what we do. So I like to think of it a little bit as our secret sauce. The last slide on this show will take you to the links for our email. So if you have questions that I don't get to, or if you need more resources, you can certainly reach out and email us. We also publish a blog, and we try to give as many user-friendly, do-it-yourself tips as we can in that blog to try and educate people as much as possible. So feel free to register for that, reach out via email, and check us out if you have any questions. So here we go. Why we date photos. For people in genealogy, this may seem very obvious because you're on a quest to figure out who your ancestors are. But we get this question a lot just from the general public. But in order to date something, we need to understand exactly what we have. So if you understand the process that it was made with and you understand the format, then we can put it into the time frame, the history timeline. I think some people are not muted, Mary. I'm picking up feedback. So you can mute everybody. I can mute everybody. Bear with me 1 second. Put up here. Okay, thank you. Anyway, once you understand the format, once you understand the process of what you have, then we can identify it in a timeline. And how this helps us is once we have that timeline, you can distinguish who's your great, your great-great, your great-great-great, and all those other ancestors kind of fall into place in that historical timeline. So obviously for genealogy projects, this is really important. The science of photography is said to have been invented over and over and over again, meaning that it's not a one-time deal. You have Fox Talbot with his thing, you have Louis Daguerre with his, and then you had technique after technique after technique after technique. And all of these techniques are patented, and many of them are unique. So when we have those unique pieces, it really helps us paint that picture for our ancestry because we have the dates. And then finally, you can share a story. So when we date these photos, we fill in the pieces and you can share your story. That's really the point. And then the last bullet point that I have up here is preservation. So as professionals, we can't preserve your pieces and we can't give you the right guidance unless we truly understand the chemistry makeup of what you have. So once we see that substrate, once we know what we're working with, we can give you the guidance on how to preserve it. And if we need to restore the originals, we can go in and work on those originals. But knowing what you have, that dating is the first step. And see if I can get to my next slide. It doesn't seem to want to go. Bryn? Oh, got it. Okay. Sorry. I've got some IT help here today. Once identified, you can establish your goals. So we talk about this a lot in the studio. What is your goal? Is your goal to share? Is your goal to preserve? Is your goal to store? And as we said, all of those different chemistries have different reactions. So knowing what you have tells us what kind of storage you need, whether or not you're going to put those in what type of album or presentation, even framing techniques when our conservator frames out originals. What we use makes a difference. How they're assembled makes a difference. So if you're going to display them, we want to do it the right way. If you're going to share them, there are certain images that we never scan. We never scan silver-based images. So ambrotypes, daguerreotypes, there are certain ways we just don't handle certain pieces. So if you want to share those pieces, we use different methods. And then, you know, you've got your genealogy, your family projects. There's ways to share things with your family members, whether it's in hard prints, reproductions, digital files, which are so popular, photo books. And then finally, it's really important to have a legacy or a succession plan for these originals. How are you going to care for them, or who's going to care for them? So we had one client come in whose mother was a part of the cleanup after one of the great wars. So after one of the world wars, I believe it was World War I, she went over to France and was a part of that cleanup, and she took hundreds of photos and put them together in this tiny little album, which was so upsetting, none of her family could open or look at that photo album. But the album was so important in history. So what we did do is we replicated those images for the family so that they would have them, and the actual originals were donated back to the museum in France. And I bring it up because you may not think your images are important, but local historical societies and museums are always looking to fill in bits and pieces. So something to consider. And next slide. Why does it matter? It probably seems silly to bring this up to a genealogy conference, but I get this on a pretty regular basis when people ask us what we do. The majority of people that we meet nowadays really don't think it's important to save their original photographs. They think taking a picture of it with a telephone, doing a quick scan, they dispose of the originals, it's considered clutter. It matters a lot. It matters a lot to us. For accuracy in terms of history and accuracy in terms of dating, getting as much information from those photos as possible, front and back. And as we go through and identify the different ones, you'll even see the millimeter thickness helps us get specific dates. So it's your story. It's for future generations. What we've learned since we've been doing this is the interest in genealogy tends to skip generations. So people who say, oh, nobody knows who these people are and we're not interested, toss it. And then they come back and say, you're not going to believe this, but my 20-some-year-old niece or nephew is hounding me for photographs because they're really, really interested. So it tends to skip generations. It doesn't go away. That interest in who you are doesn't leave. Of course, preservation. Not all photography is equal. As I said, there are different formats. So the process and the format equates to the storage and the methodology that we use for preservation. And finally, there's value. There are many rare and collectible pieces, and if you don't know what you have, then you simply don't know the actual value. Before we get into identifying the formats, I'd like to talk a little bit about portraiture in the past, because I'm assuming we're going to be looking primarily, most genealogists are looking primarily at portraits. So let's just look at why people did portraits. They were, trying to capture a moment in time, trying to capture a memory. But the general rule of thumb, the general thought was bigger was better. So when I was giving this talk to my 16-year-old last night who just got his learner's permit, I was explaining to him that if someone wanted to have something of significance today, they would build a really, really big house, or they would buy a fancy car, a really fancy car. It wasn't the idea of, I'll just get this picture done so that I have something. There was no snapshot mentality. There wasn't capturing all of those moments. So it was, let's put on our absolute best clothes, and the bigger, the better. So early tintypes, early images that could be made large, they would make them large by stacking frames. So it helps us date things if they're in their original housing, because when we see those stacked frames, we can actually use that housing, and we can use the size of these pieces to kind of zone in on the time period. But the idea was bigger is better. There was a mentality in people's homes of the parlor. The parlor was a very special room. It was a place of honor in the house. Important things happened in the parlor. You met with important people. Children didn't typically go in there and run around and play. It wasn't the living room of today. It was the parlor. It was where you got married. It was where someone was laid out in a wake service. So you'd have these large, beautiful photographs or crayon portraits or artwork displayed in deep stacked frames in this place of importance, and people saved up their money and put them in there. They would have their Victorian albums, their cabinet cards. They were, we'll get into that a little bit more, but understand that the mentality behind photography was really significant. It wasn't, just grab this shot. So when we look at these images, remembering that it was really important and knowing that they were commemorating a life event or a significant time helps us get into a date as well. And then finally, as the last bullet says, Sunday best. People wore their finest pieces of clothes, and they also wore some of their finest jewelry. They wore their most up-to-date hairstyle. So that's going to help us figure things out too. So we're going to start with daguerreotypes. For the purposes of this presentation, we're using a short list. There are many, many, many types of photography, as I said, that popped up through history, all unique. So at the same time as the daguerreotype, you had salt prints and other more unique carbon prints, cyanotypes, all different types popping up. But we're looking at what the masses and most people would have. So Louis Daguerre in France invented or developed the daguerreotype in 1839. The reason it became so incredibly popular was because he sold his patent to the French government, and the French government made it free. And if you read about this, they'll say there's quotes about the camera obscura actually selling out overnight. There were so many new practitioners jumping onto this new technology of creating daguerreotypes, sold in kits. So they were extremely popular. Loads of people had them, but they're rare to find in collections today. Why are they rare today? They are rare because they are fragile, and at a time when everybody had it, nobody took care of it. So if it is a fragile piece, kind of like, let's say everybody went and got photo keychains made today, but if you used it and carried it around, eventually they fall apart. So they're great. I love daguerreotypes. They are single positive images. There is no negative. It is a thin piece of copper that is highly polished and has a silver emulsion that's polished to a super high sheen on top of it, and the image is exposed directly onto that. So why is this important? when you want to identify a daguerreotype, if you look at the image on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see a funny tone to it. Daguerreotypes literally look like mirrors. When you hold them and move them back and forth, it'll mirror back at you. So if it looks like a highly polished mirror finish, then it's most likely that you have a daguerreotype. If you look at the sample in front of you, this one has actually been housed by our museum conservator, so that's not typical framing. That actually has all of the oxygen sucked out of it. I mean, that's a really sophisticated conservation fitting. But if you look very closely at the edge of the brass mat, you're going to see the oxidation lines, and that is what happens to daguerreotypes. If you open a daguerreotype and you break the seal, that seal that's so important, take it out, the silver will tarnish, just like any beautiful piece of silver jewelry or silver teapot. It will turn black, and there's no way to reverse that. So the only thing we can really do is slow it down and preserve it. So it's so important with daguerreotypes not to open them, or if you have to handle them, find a professional or wear gloves, but try not to ever break the seal. If you want to try and zoom in on dating these, because they went on for so long, this one has a planar brass mat. Planar brass mats indicate older daguerreotypes from the 1840s, and then the mats became more ornate in the 1850s. So the planar ones are the older ones. Can be a little bit deceptive, so that burn line actually helps you a little bit if you think that the seal hasn't been broken. They're so popular, people tended to switch them in and out of their cases. But the older mats have the simpler, the older daguerreotypes have the simpler matting. They were always housed in caskets. So the casket, or also known as a union case, they were made of leather. Later ones are made out of thermoplastic. There were some that were made of really incredibly well done paper mache, but they should be sealed in their cases. So that's your clue on daguerreotypes. Ambrotypes. Ambrotypes are a completely different process than daguerreotypes, but they're housed the same way because of their fragility. So if you look at the other slide, from 1839 is when you have your beginning daguerreotypes. Your ambrotypes didn't come into effect until around 1852, and they went all the way through 1870. These are basically glass negatives. That's the easiest way to say this. They're glass negatives. You can identify them because the whites are this funny, creamy, grayish color, and they're backed with either like a Chinese black lacquer, they're painted black on the back, or they have black backing paper. It's very common for the miniature artists, the miniature portrait artists, to jump into this field, and you'll see many of them are tinted. So on our gentleman here, it's hard to see on the screen, but his emblem on his hat, his sleeve, his cheeks, they're actually painted in with a little bit of coloration, a little bit of leaf, and then on top of that, some do and some don't have a lacquer protecting them. Why is that important? Well, the lacquer finish on them protects that silver emulsion and helps it. So if you touch a daguerreotype, you're going to have the same thing happen, or excuse me, an ambrotype. You're going to have the same thing happen that happens to a daguerreotype because it is silver surface. But many of them had an actual lacquer coating on them. If they're not lacquered, there's no shine to it, and it'll look just like a negative. So how can you tell if you have a daguerreotype and you don't want to open this seal? You're going to look through the darkest part of the image. And when you get your magnifier on the darkest part of the image, you should be able to actually see through the depth of the glass and either see the black backing paper or see almost the flaking of the lacquer, but it's not going to be single surface. You'll be able to see a delineation between the top layer of the emulsion and the bottom layer of the black. So that's how we identify it. Conservation tips, again, it's supposed to live in its little housing. We don't recommend ever breaking the seals and taking them out. These are very sensitive to light, air, humidity, and water because of what the surface is made of. So light, air, humidity, and water. And I do have clients that keep these in safety deposit boxes because it's temperate and the humidity is controlled, the air conditioning is correct. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to use the Q&A. So that's the ambrotypes.
I do have a question, Marylou.
Yeah.
From Christmas, and he wants to know where we could find business records of photographers from the late 19th century. Is there a database, and where would they be located?
From the late 19th century, is there a database? Let's come back to that because we have a slide on that coming up about locating photographers. So we'll come back to that one. But it's a great question, and it's further in here. Tintypes. So tintypes are actually made with the same process of ambrotypes, with the exception that instead of being the wet collodion negative, instead of being on a sheet of glass, it's now on a sheet of iron. It's not tin at all. And they're also known as ferrotypes. They have a couple of different names. They run from 1853 all the way into the 1930s. These are pretty significant because tintypes set the stage for what happens later on in photography. Everyone moved over to tins and away from ambrotypes because they were durable. And what you'll see in photography is that the tide moves with what is not necessarily quality, with what is faster and what is cheaper. So tintypes were more durable, and they were cheap to make, and they were fast to make. You didn't have to wait long for the emulsion to dry. Again, the one in front of you's got the lady's necklace, or her brooch, and her earrings are embellished. Her ring is embellished. They're always on metal. They have the same funny cream, green, gray tones, and they're actually quite fragile because they have a silver surface as well. They came in, all of these came in plate sizes, from full plates down to 6 plates. There were even smaller ones though on tins. And the reason tins are significant is this. Early tins are housed in caskets, union cases, very deep stacked frames, really trying to imitate the aristocracy in terms of portraiture. Then as it becomes more and more common, they actually run the same time period as carte de vis and cabinet cards. So the housings change, and you'll see them in the same paper housing as a carte de vis. They are the predecessor of the photo booth. And there was actually, with carte de vis, there's another invention that leads to this, but they actually came up with a method of shooting more than one at a time. So the early ones are very formal, and then as you go further and further and further into, as you get close to the 30s, they become more fun. They're country fair items, and those country fair items are actually exceptionally collectible because they'll have people in their everyday clothing and in casual poses and in doing really fun things like boxing or all kinds of things. So they really have significance in history. So the multiplying camera was invented just for the tintype. They figured out how they could shoot actually 12 to 16 images at once and cut them down into postage stamp sizes so that people could share them. And again, precursor to the photo booth. And one of the things to look for if you're looking for value is to look for the ones that have patriotic sleeves. The patriotic sleeves tend to be more collectible. Conservation tips are exactly the same, because it's the same science as the ambrotype. So we move forward to carte de vis. Carte de vis, one of my favorite things, and they are, we're moving away now from wet collodion negatives, and we're moving into albumin prints. So these are albumin, and the next few things we go over are albumin. So the science is changing in 1859. This is where you're going to see a big break off in the scientific process of photography. So they went from 1859 to 1905. As I said, there's Victorian cartomania, and they used the same technology, the multiplying camera of the tintype, to create and shoot the cabinet card. Why this is significant is because it was the first time ordinary people could become collectors. So There's quotes about the penny politician, people who were voted for on a penny because they could have so many of these made and distributed. But ordinary people could collect religious figures, political figures, military figures, entertainers, and this is really the predecessor to the calling card. So the question about finding the photographers, carte de vis are one of the first forms that have the photographer listed on the back. It gave them just enough information to try and find them. Albumin emulsion is important for storage and preservation, but it's important for us in terms of identifying. And again, the significance in history. It is a positive image. It was made with a negative. Think what else? Oh, albumin prints. You can always identify an albumin print, whether it's a carte de vis, a cabinet card, or other forms of albumin prints, because they have a gloss to them. So they have a somewhat of a glossy surface, and sometimes they would actually wax the surface, and that's how you know you have an albumin print. Salt prints came out earlier. They look similar, but they have a matte finish. So if you don't have that gloss, you could potentially have a salt print, and then you can get your date off the salt print. Trying to think if I've missed anything. Oh, okay. So this is important for dating. So carte de vis, obviously, it looks like a business card size, but you can date your carte de vis based on the thickness, based on the millimeter depth of your card. So if you follow me, the thin stock carte de vis has square corners. It was made from 1860 to 1870, and it's 0.4 millimeters in depth. So that's 1860 to 1870. 0.5 millimeter stock with square or rounded corners is from 1870 to 1875. 0.6 millimeter stock with square or rounded corners is from 1873 to 1884. They just get thicker. 0.7 millimeters from 1879 to the 1890s. And finally, the thickest cards were 1 to 1.3 millimeters, and they were circa 1900 and 1910. So if you're trying to date your cabinet cards, you can date them based on that card stock. Crayon portraits. Crayon portraits are enlargements from carte de vis or from cabinet cards. They were made using a sun enlarger. They were developed around 1860, and they were popular all the way to the turn of the century. So the sun enlarger didn't give you a really fine reproduction. It gave kind of a grainy reproduction, and it was projected onto a very thin piece of photo paper. Most of these are exceptionally fragile. And so the photographer, as an artist, would have this weak photographic image to work with, and they would do extensive handwork in pastel, which is where crayon comes from, or charcoal. Most of these, like the couple you see in front of you, that's actually two images overlaid. That's not one group of people standing in front of the camera. That's two carte de vis or two cabinet cards being projected onto a single image. So if you're trying to date a crayon portrait, it's going to be tricky. You really need your carte de vis or your cabinet card if you can get back to the original. Why? Because when someone today gets a portrait taken or sits for an oil painting, they'll ask the photographer to change how they look. They'll say, will you take 10 pounds off of me? Or they want to look more modern. Many of these, the photographers would take liberty and update the clothing styles, update the hairstyles, and add embellishments that were true to the style. So they were made, a lot of them were made posthumously to honor someone and to have that important person's image hang in the parlor. So crayon portraits are a little tricky because they're not the first source of the image. And again, depending on how important people were was the size and the embellishment that they could afford to have. They're neat. The Victorians loved crayon portraits. They come in oval, octagonal, something called cove corner, which is your rectangle with rounded corners, cathedral. Many of them were convex. Many octagonals, cove corners, and ovals were all convex. And then again, they used a lot of standard sizes, or what we identify as standard, with 16 by 20 and 20 by 24. Again, this is a silver emulsion, And as you can see in the sample that's up here, this has extensive silverfish damage, so very fragile. So conservation tips on these. It's important to realize that crayon portraits, when a photographer embellished them and they used charcoal or pastels, they didn't fix them. They're an unfixed surface. So we do a lot of work trying to save crayon portraits that people have tried to clean, and they've actually just wiped off the emulsion or wiped off all of the embellishment. So really important that a trained conservator work on an original crayon portrait and that you don't attempt, it doesn't even have the stability of an albumin print. It's a very matte finish and with an unfixed embellishment on it. And unfortunately, the frames on these were so beautiful during Victorian times that today the damage we see is primarily because people took the frames and repurposed them for other things, or the fitting fell apart. There was all different types of degradation, but typically when they're taken out of their housing, they don't stand much of a chance. So moving forward, cabinet cards. Cabinet cards are the most common of all old photos. Highly collectible, exactly same technology as the carte de viste, just a little bigger, called a cabinet card because you could see it from a distance. They were popular from 1866 to 1900. However, I put versus European up on the screen for a reason. We still have European cabinet cards that come out as late as the 1930s, and that is very late. And understanding that we are a nation made up of a lot of immigrants, you can imagine that if you have a cabinet card in your collection and you're trying to date it and it looks like it's well after 1900, if you're not anticipating that European heritage, you really need that European heritage part of the story to understand why you would have such a late product. Called a cabinet card because they would display it from across the room. Again, albumin emulsion. The Victorians actually created albums just for carte de viste and just for cabinet cards. So in order to help you date the cabinet cards, I have a couple more slides in here. The carte de viste, was introduced in 1859, and I've got the size on here for you. The cabinet card was introduced in 1866. But there's also what people would assume is a cabinet card, but it's called the promenade card, introduced in 1874, the boudoir, and the imperial. Now, I only put up 5 of these, but the list of cabinet cards and their sizes and years of introductions is actually quite extensive. So if anyone is interested in that list, email me and I can send you the entire list. I also have the list for the European sizes and the European years, and I'm happy to share that with you. It's just way too much to put on a slide. Okay, cabinet cards again. There's a lot of information on cabinet cards, but as I said, they're the most popular. You can identify cabinet cards based on the color of the cardstock. Now, there's a lot of differing information online about this, and I went online to try and verify some of it. So I'm a real skeptic when it comes to believing what I read unless I can see some provenance, but this is what I can tell you that we can discover from what we've been reading, and we can back it up. So there was a variety of colors, obviously from 1860 to 1910, but the maroon or dark green were circa 1880, gold borders are pre-1885, scalloped edges after the mid-1800s, and then the impressed border and lettering again in the 1890s. I hope that's helpful. If you need more information on this, I actually have more charts on it. Stamp tax. This is always fun. If you're going to Google this and you look up the stamp tax, you're going to find the Boston Tea Party. So what you really need is the Sun Picture Tax. And this was a tax that the US government put into place to fund the ongoing Civil War. It was going on longer than they thought. They needed money, so in comes the Sun Picture Tax. It's called the Sun Picture Tax because that's how these photographs were developed. So it was placed on daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, tintypes, and carte de viste. And when you see this on picture tax and you know it was from 1864 to 1866, it just proves the point that daguerreotypes were still being produced, ambrotypes were still being produced, obviously tintypes and carte de vis. These are really interesting because the photographers were supposed to hand cancel these with a date. So if you find the stamp on the back, typically of your carte de vis, many of them just have an X, and that's because you had a lazy photographer. But they were actually supposed to use their initials, and they were actually supposed to put the specific date of when it was canceled. It's a postage stamp because they didn't come out with a special stamp just for this tax. They used an actual US postage stamp. And this is super collectible because not just for people into photography, but for stamp collectors are really looking for these. And the coveted one for stamp collectors is the rare red stamp. So for a stamp collector, that's a 1 cent denomination. It was used on any image costing less than 10 cents. And it was only used from March of 1865 to August of 1866. The stamp on your screen is not a red stamp. The red stamp looks much darker. It's a much darker red. And again, March of 1865 to August of 1866. Another clue for dating these pieces is to look for where the stamp would have fallen off. Many carte de vis, many of their little paper holders, even some of the tintypes actually have the adhesion mark and a darkening mark of where the glue from the stamp was. So if you go back and visit your tintypes and your carte de vis, many times you can see the outline of that stamp or where it was burned into the back and get you closer to the date of your actual piece. Before we move on, I just want to double check if anyone has any questions about the previous slide. I'm just going to go back because we're moving on to printing out papers and other formats, but daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, tintypes, they're all their own animal. Carte de vis, cabinet cards, they're all their own animal. And you can certainly email me if you want more information and more nitty-gritty, but the next group of photo papers is its own little point in history. Or if you need a break. Mary, are we good? We're good, thank you. All right, so next is what we refer to as POP, printing out papers and other formats. After the albumin print, the gelatin silver print came into existence. Why did this happen? Because, again, faster, cheaper. Manufacturers figured out a way to make pre-sensitized pieces of paper. The albumin prints had to be sensitized by the photographer before they were used, and manufacturers came out and developed ways to sell them in packets, and that's where this comes from. And there's a huge array of manufacturers for printing out papers, basically until Eastman Kodak came along and kind of took the corner of the market. So these are silver gelatin prints, and my favorite ones, and we still use silver gelatin papers even today, and my favorite ones, and the ones we see the most often in here, are actually postcards. So I gave you a chart on the dates of all the different chemistry of photographic postcards, and if it's too small or if you'd like me to email it to you, I'm happy to share it online. But we see lots and lots of postcards that have an image on the front and the postcard format on the back. And then these are treasures for ancestry, because if they have the stamp or if they have the postmark or they have the date, then obviously you don't need this chart because you have the date. But if you don't, many of them were blank. It helps to be able to identify the paper type and identify the date. Oh, I'm going to back up for 1 second. Printing out papers, when I said that there were a lot of them, if you want to know what kind of printing out paper you have, the layer structure is what tells us as photographers what it is. And so there's a silver layer emulsion, then a binding layer, and then your actual substrate. And we can identify these as gelatin, collodion, casein, starch, or albumin. And that helps us on a scientific end determine a little bit more about the paper but you're not going to be able to do that without a microscope. But if you do need help figuring out the type of paper you have, you just bring it to a professional and we can help you with that.
Marylou.
Yes.
Karen Dole has a question. She says, you said 1865, but the slide says 1864.
On which one?
I don't know.
Which slide?
Karen, which slide? Okay, she hasn't come back yet.
Yeah, if she could repost that, that's fine.
Okay.
All right. Modern examples. This is where we get into fiber versus resin coated. Fiber papers are still used today. We still use them internally in our studio. They are the gold standard. But most people moved on to resin coated papers in the late 50s and from the 60s and on forward. Resin coated paper was invented by the US Army. It was just faster. They needed it during the wars. It dries faster. There's just a lot of benefits if you're looking for speed and price to resin coated photo papers. And we can look at the emulsion of a resin coated paper and tell you a little bit more about the date. But it does take, it just takes a trained eye. But most people have someone alive or somebody in their family history for the more modern photographic examples. So if you're stuck, we're happy to look at it. Fiber papers that are hand tinted and they're brown toned and then colorized really can be deceptive for some untrained people. I've answered a lot of questions over the years about that. So if you have questions on modern chemistry, it's not hard to get those answers from Family Tree, but we're certainly here to help you. But I feel like I'm preaching to the choir to a group of genealogists on the difference in Polaroids and black and white prints. So the important thing to know is when RC prints came into existence, because early RC prints can help you. It's also really important for us because conservation and preservation of fiber prints versus RC prints, early negatives, later negatives. But for dating things, if you have your negatives, actually, if you have your early negatives, if you haven't gotten rid of them, they're fantastic for a professional to look at and tell you and zero in on the year it was made. So negatives, I didn't even put that in this presentation, but your format of negative will tell us a great deal about when that was created because we can see so much that we actually can't see in the print based on the negative and based on the format. And then color photography, there's a lot of new mediums, dye sublimation and digital mediums as well. And if you're interested in learning how to preserve those, we can certainly, you can certainly email us. We write about it all the time. The little boy in the picture, that's a fiber print that's hand tinted. And it's nice to know that those originals can be saved and can be preserved. All right, so this addresses the question about the photographer. You would have to look at city directories. And when you're looking at your images, when you're looking at your carte de vis, and you're looking at your cabinet cards, the photographers were great, especially on the bigger cabinet cards, at running these great advertisements with all this filigree and their pricing. So you want to find the city directory, and you're really going to have to, there's only so much we can give you based on chemistry. So the family story is going to fill in the blanks. But like the sample that we have up here of Frankfurt Avenue, so that is a local Baltimore woman. Frankfurt Avenue is a street in Baltimore. You could go, we can date that based on the style and the chemistry, and that's one of the pop prints, that's one of the printed out paper prints. Zero in on that and try to get the city directory from the Enoch Pratt Library and figure out who E.J. Davis was. Again, many photographers were only in business for a few years. Many of the early photographs, the tintypes, the ambrotypes, even the daguerreotypes, many of the early photographers, they were traveling salesmen. They were basically peddlers with carts. They would go into a town, set up shop, on an annual or biannual basis, take their photographs, and then move on. And people would save up their money knowing that they wanted to have a portrait done in the spring when the photographer came to town. So many of them were only in business for a few years, and it was kind of a vagabond trade. They got into it, they traveled the country. Eventually they may have settled down and opened a studio somewhere, or they kept their route. But a lot of them did not have established studios. Very early photographers had to have a studio because people had to stand still for so long. Their roofs, they had entire walls made out of glass to let sunlight in. So early photographers, yes, they were studio based, but many photographers over time were actually just traveling salesmen.
Marylou?
Yes.
She said the one before the tax stamp.
Which one? Oh, cabinet cards?
Yeah, she said, you said 1865, but slide says 1864.
Oh, for the Sun picture stamp. Okay, maybe she's talking about the tax one. I don't know. Maybe she can send me an email because I can't seem to
Yeah, the
line
tax
up.
one. That's one she's talking about, the stamp tax.
The stamp tax. Okay, I know what she's talking about. So the Sun picture stamp tax was from 1864 to 1866. That is correct. However, the red stamp was only issued from March of 1865 to August of 1866. So there are different colored stamps. They were in 1, 2, and 3 cent denominations, and there's green, blue, orange, red. There are different colors of stamps. And the point of that I made about 1865, that only applies to the rare red stamp. It was only in existence from March 1865 to August 1866. Does that help? Okay, and then after that, the stamp tax was repealed. Good question, thank you. All right, we're gonna slip ahead to scenes and settings. So this is where we're getting out of the science and into what genealogists do best and figure out what's going on, okay? This is where genealogists get all of their family data and start to figure things out. So prior to 1884, photographs had to be taken outside, or because they needed natural light, or they were done in that studio that had the glass roof and the glass walls that I was telling you about. So if you have a studio photo and you can match your chemistry, you can figure out about the time frame that it was prior to 1884. And then the obvious things that, well, they seem obvious to us, but this little girl standing on a prop, that alligator is obviously not a real alligator, it's a prop, and she's in front of a backdrop. So this is a really fun photograph. It would have been taken at a fair. It would have been taken, it wouldn't have been, let's put on our confirmation or our first communion dress and go stand on an alligator. So this is a really fun vacation photo that this little girl is posed on, and you would want to line up your family history and learn more about that. You want to look for props, street signs, possessions, anything in the background. That backdrop is obviously, it's a painted backdrop, and you can see the wrinkles on the floor of the backdrop. So you'll know that she's in a studio setting or she's in a tent somewhere. Fashion. So we could do a whole talk just on fashion. So I want to share a few things with you about that. As I stated earlier, people usually wore their best attire, and it's really important to remember that these photos were usually taken to commemorate a life event. So Queen Victoria made the white dress fashionable, but she's also in Europe, and it took a long time for the European styles to cross the Atlantic and then filter through the main street USA. So most women were actually married in either a black, brown, or a gray practical dress. So a lot of the wedding photos of these young women were in darker dresses. If you're looking at a group photo, you want to look at the younger persons in the photo. If it's a large family, you don't want to look at the tiny children because they're in hand-me-downs. You want to look at the teenagers who are growing really fast. And you definitely don't want to consider the mom and dad because they would keep their older style and usually the older style hairstyle. So you want to look at the person in the photo and determine who is most likely to have new clothes. That's the key on dating family photos. You know, pay attention to the waist and the necklines on women, their skirt length, their sleeves. The fabric can be really difficult to ascertain just from a photograph, but it is doable. And in gentlemen, you want to look at the men's collars and neckties. So I'll give you a very practical hint. We're located in Baltimore, Maryland, and I am asked all the time to date images for Baltimore, Maryland. So what we did is we went to one of the oldest boys' colleges, schools in town, went to their archives and photographed every single class portrait. And from every single class portrait, you can see a distinctive difference in collars, ties, and hairstyles, parts, and they're all dated year to year to year to year. And you can do that same thing with the women's institutions and come up with a pretty accurate fashion history for you to reference for your time and place, for your town. So if you're in Ohio or you're in Texas, they may not have the same fashion that we're going to see in Baltimore, Maryland. But if you can find your oldest institution, or if you know your ancestors the photographs were taken in DC or in Boston, go to your older institutions and look at their archives. So men's collars and ties were easily interchanged year to year to year, and their lapel styles change. My favorite resource, and I'll hold it up for you, I don't know if people can actually see me or not, is this book. It's nice and thick too. Dressed for the Photographer, Ordinary Americans in Fashion from 1840 to 1900. It's written by Joan, Severa, and it's a compendium of fashion, and it gives on each page, actually, hold this up so you guys can see it. Every page has a different photograph, identifies the format and type of chemistry and the provenance, which is so important, which is how we can get an accurate dating and description of all of the clothing for the time. So she's really considered the authority. Our studio created a cheat sheet, and that cheat sheet is about 4 pages long, going from the 1840s throughout this entire book, giving you a breakdown on waist, hair, collars, cuffs, and if anyone is interested, just email us and I can get that to you. Fashion is critical. We'll send it out later. Yeah, we'll send it out later, but fashion is critical for determining the time period. So if you have the fashion, you have your format, you have your location, we can usually zero in on a pretty good date. Family history, I know I've mentioned this, but most photographs were staged and posed. It took a long time to expose these pictures. They weren't accidents, they're not snapshots. It was a concerted effort by the family to get everyone together, get them dressed. Many of the antique photos that we work on in here are taken outside of the house, and they want to have their dog and their horse and their wagon, and their best stuff is in these photos, which for us is great because it gives us clues, because we can date people. There are people who can date those wagons. So where did the photo come from? You want to study where it was taken, how they were posed. You also want to study the order that the people are in, because usually the parents are front and center, or the grandparents are front and center. Who did the photo come from? How did you get it? Where was it? Are you in Florida and did you get it from somebody in New York? How did they inherit it? So you've got to find that context of family history, and then be a detective. Use the context clues to help you date the photo. So the image before, and I'll just flip back, this was one that we actually restored an original crayon portrait, but it was in such terrible condition, and I think it's on our blog on our website. It was in such terrible, terrible condition, and you couldn't see the locket. And after explaining to our client how it was made, he went home and actually found the actual carte de visite, and we were able to bring the locket back. So some people actually have the heirlooms. And then tips. In order for us to date, we need as much of the original photo as possible. Even all of the books and guidelines that we use, they actually give me an image of what the emulsion looks like under a microscope. So the more of the original image that we have, the more information we can give a genealogist. It's that simple. Knowing when a photo wasn't taken, so knowing when someone had an accident and was paralyzed, then you know before or after. There was so much early death from disease. So if you know someone died of scarlet fever, or if you know they didn't make it past the age of 7, when you look at these photographs, you can, knowing when it wasn't taken can help us get there too. And then finally, work with your family. It's so important. We work with so many people who struggle to get their hands on their photos because family members won't share them. So working with them and sharing the story, that's part of this process. And if you're not sure where to start, just give us a call a genealogist. If you're not sure where to start with your photos, you can certainly call us. I have people come in with boxes of photographs, and we can sort them out in record time, and just by emulsion, just by format, and help you get at least started so it won't be overwhelming. So just to do, I'm going to do a really quick review. So first step, identify the type of photo, format the process. Second, if you can, identify the photographer or the location that it was taken. Next, determine your scene and setting. 4, focus on clothing and hairstyle. I know we could do an entire seminar just on clothing and hairstyles. And then finally, match up clues from your family history. And then before we get into this part, does anyone have any questions? All right. Well, what I'm hoping is we did have several people email us actual photographs and try to get us to help them identify them. So since no one has any questions, I'm hoping that you guys have all the answers and you can help me identify and tell me a little bit about this image that was emailed to us. So take a moment, and if you want to use your chat function, or if you want to use Q&A to send Mary a message, take a minute to look at this and tell me how old you think these images are. Your best guess. Mary, you should be making some Jeopardy music or something for us.
Okay, I haven't gotten anything yet.
Nobody has any guesses? So Bryn's helping put up the chat function.
Carol Dybel says probably early 1900s.
Why? Give us something, Carol.
Mary Frances says 1890s. Chris Smithson goes 1880 to 1900. And Karen Dahl goes, man, late 1800s. But no reasons why.
No reasons why. We need reasons why. We need reasons how you come up with this. This is what we just did. So I'm going to give you a few clues that we can see. Now, keep in mind that these were emailed to us. So without the physical piece, this is pretty tricky. With the physical piece in the studio, we could really have some fun with this. But if you look closely at your screen, and we'll start with the woman. The top of the column where the emulsion layer is worn off. Can everyone? I hope you can see that. I feel like I'm talking to myself, and I know I'm not. But at the top corner on the left, where the emulsion is worn off, you're going to see that dark gray coloration. And on the gentleman, under his arm, he looks a little bit like a cartoon cutout because of the way he's painted. You'll see a dark gray spots. Will this show if I use my thing? Can they see this? Yeah. Okay. All right. So this is what I'm talking about on the woman. See this? And over here on this gentleman, this dark gray. Well, that's telling me, from my knowledge base, that that is a tintype. And that is the metal sheen coming through underneath of that emulsion layer. And then we know that tintypes have a very, very long history, right? So we got a long time span. Well, based on our research internally, we actually own quite a collection of these, so I have a little bit of an advantage. This gentleman obviously is painted, so you can see this line, this discernment of how he is painted, full painting. So they really wanted to be important. And she's fully painted over here. And this gentleman is wearing a Windsor tie knot. He has what we call a wing-tipped collar, sometimes called the patricide from folklore. And his collar and his tie were popular from the 1870s into the 1890s. So that's what his tie and his collar tell us. But he's an older gentleman, right? And this is considered a mourning suit. So what we know is his clothing dates to the 1870s and the 1890s. Now, I haven't talked to whoever sent them, but if they were taken, or if they're a set, if they were taken at the same time, this is all we have to go on, is his tie and his collar and his suit. But if they were taken together, we have a few more clues, because the woman is wearing a very significant dress. She's got on what's considered a college girl dress. It appears to have a bustle, and she's wearing a wristlet. I think I lost my mouse. But do you see the wristlet hanging off of her wrist over here? And this is called a shawl collar. And the shawl collar dates to 1921 to 1924. So we know that tintypes have this incredible span of time. If they're a couple, we would have to use her dress and her collar to get the latest date. Obviously, studio, this is a studio portrait. This is a backdrop. This is a prop. And then we have her black underskirt here on her college girl attire. So using what we have based on their clothing and their format, the latest date we can come up with is 1921 to 1924 on her clothing. On him, if he was done at the same time, we would use her date. Other than that, we're stuck right in the 1890s with this collar.
Okay, Karen Dawes said, woman 1920s seems modern. Chris Smithson says, the man looks like it's a cutout. And Mary Frances says, dress style and the look of the metal. And some of your other guesses were Beth Moore, 1890. And Sally said 1910, looking at man's tie. And Beth Moore just said 1890s.
Well, I can tell you based on working with these and based on what we imagine the size of the plate, I think the lady who sent them in said they were 4 1/4 by 3 1/4, which is a pretty good size plate. These would have been out of style after the 1890s. To have something this size and painted, it wouldn't have been in vogue. But the tricky thing here is her clothing. So again, unless you have the originals, unless you have those clues to the family history, we're stuck. And I love these examples because they show us the limitations of working off of a screen. They show us the limitations of a digital file. And just to answer the question, the reason this gentleman looks like a cutout is because of the way he was painted. And without seeing the original, this could have been a bad restoration job. I'm not sure. So I would have to see it. But I do get them in here frequently that they were flaking and they were in trouble, and then somebody went in and did some in painting, and it just is a poor job. But again, without the original, we don't know. So we're going to try 2 more that were sent in. Bryn, how do I get to the next? There we go. All right, here we go. Can you identify? So we've got this lovely Victorian couple here, and if you want to take a minute and see if you can give me a good guess on based on what you learned today, hopefully, and what you know of when you think this picture was taken.
Okay, Carol Dybel says the original is actually much clearer.
Yeah, we don't have it. So the technology that we use, the technology we use in the studio, we can actually focus in on the dust specks in the photograph, and we don't have that ability from a computer screen. Oh, I can't hear you, Mary. Hold on. Can you unmute?
There.
Oh, sorry.
Karen Dahl said 1870s. Chris Smithson says she looks like she's wearing a morning dress. Beth Moore, 1880s to 1890s. And Jane Smith, 1860s, black dress on woman, their Sunday best.
So Jane Smith is right on with the black dress on woman being her Sunday best. Many people's best dress would have been a black dress because it was the go-to dress. So what we know from our research, now again, if we had the physical card and we could look at the attributes of the card, if we could look at the attributes of the emulsion, we could pair it up with some of our other charts and zoom in a little bit based on the chemistry. But based on what we can see, it's a studio portrait. Obviously he's in a chair, there's a carpet. They actually have a carpet over top of the table that he's on, that his arm is leaning on. He's holding some kind of a book, so we don't know if that's a Bible. We don't know what he's holding, but we know that the woman's bonnet is pre-Civil War. We know that her black dress is post-Civil War. And in our research, we found her style prevalent from the 1870s at the earliest all the way into the 1890s. The gentleman's beard is called a chin strap or a Lincolness, and that beard style began in the 1850s. And then he has his black suit, has a scarf, not a tie. So his attire, he's an older gentleman, but his attire, his look goes all the way back to the 1850s. So the most recent thing we can find in the photograph would be her attire, which can be dated from the 1870s and in vogue all the way through the 1890s. So again, we don't, without that physical card, without that chemistry, we're guessing. But if we had the card itself and we could combine the clothing information, then we could get a little closer to the date. So I love this. I love being able to judge something off a screen because I have so many people who are scanning their collections and then disposing of them to save space. And then when they come back, you know, it's just such a great way to teach someone why you need to keep your originals. I mean, I know it's not convenient for the whole feng shui thing that's going on right now, but I mean, how much space do they really take up? If you have the original, or if we could see the back even, or we could see the millimeter of thickness, we could zoom in and get a little more information. And this is our last young man. I love this piece. And if you want to take a minute and take a stab at him, he's pretty fun.
Okay, on the previous one, Beth Moore said, it reminds me of the Laura Ingalls Wilder photos.
Yeah, It does.
No. 1920 to 1940, Karen Dahl.
That's a really, really good guess, yeah.
1900 to 1920, from Chris Smithson. Is he going off to college? 1910s, Beth Moore.
So this is really interesting. This is a tintype, obviously. His tie was colored in, his cheeks are colored in. He's taken in a studio. You can see where the backdrop actually hits the carpet and the drape to the right-hand side. Again, he's got his hand on a book, and he's in a formal suit. What's interesting is he has no facial hair, so it implies a young man. There's no beard. He's in a formal dress suit, which is possibly a frock suit. And the frock suit is early 1900s, I believe. And what for us, on my end, that makes this interesting is that's a carte de vis setting. So that is the paper sleeve that we were talking about when carte de vis were popular, and they eventually, in order to save money, stopped using the caskets, the union cases for tintypes, and eventually started putting them into these beautiful little embossed cardstocks. So turn of the century would be correct for this gentleman. 1900s is about as close as we can get on him without having the actual card, flipping him over and looking at the back information. So his collar, his tie, again, I would pull up based on family history. If we know who this is and we know where it's taken, we want to go to those archives and look up the collar and see what that collar tells us for the time period. But that's exactly, you know, where we would go with this. But definitely turn of the century, because this is pretty much the height of carte de vis and the end of the latter end of the tintypes. So anywhere from 1900, 1920. And that's it. So thank you for sticking with me. I hope that wasn't too dry. My 16-year-old had to endure this talk last night, and he had a lot of questions, helped me with my slides. As I said, we have a team here. Everybody has something different to offer in terms of expertise. If you have everything from movie films, slides, glass plate negatives, Amy does oil paintings. If you have questions, we're here for you. If you're looking for more information, you can sign up for our newsletter. We publish a blog. It's the same articles in the newsletter. They're in the blog. It just, the newsletter pops up and asks you to read it. Basically, it's just a reminder. We're a very small business. COVID kind of kicked us pretty hard. So, you know, if you're thinking about supporting small business, please think of us. And I just want to say thank you. Thank you for sticking out with me this morning. This was a long talk, and I appreciate it. And Mary, thank you, and the Historical Society for having me.